Hi everyone. So the topic today that I'm going to be talking about for my meeting hall presentation is the topic of human trafficking in Nebraska. So what's the problem? So a quick overview on what human trafficking is for those that may not know. It's a $150 billion industry worldwide. It involves both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. This involves recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for commercial sex or labor that's induced by fraud, force, or coercion. Imagine being thrown into a situation like this. Many of these people are thrown into the human trafficking rink and lose their entire lives, their mental health, their physical health, and life as they used to know. This happens way more than many of us are led to believe. It wasn't even less than 2 weeks ago that I was followed around a grocery store for more than 30 minutes and had to have my fiance come and pick me up that day. Human trafficking rates are continuing to rise and are very prevalent. Just in the year 2020, there was 118,932 victims identified globally. In the year 2015, there was 77,823 victims identified. This is a huge jump. This is about a 41,000 rise in victims from the year 2015 to 2020. And these are only victims that are identified. There are many victims that are never discovered and many traffickers that are never caught. To bring this issue to our community, in the year 2020 in Nebraska, there was 487 victims identified. To say the least, the way that we are going about human trafficking needs to change on a regular basis, or even at all. The need to step up as a community and fix the issue is only continuing to rise. Human trafficking has been around for a long time. The earliest form of it began with the African slave trade. The U.S. followed as rates continued to rise and banned slavery in 1820. In 2000, the U.S. made human trafficking a federal crime. In Nebraska in 2016, they followed the U.S.'s footsteps and increased penalties for trafficking. Though this is the case, rates are still continuing to rise, as I just mentioned. Human trafficking does not discriminate on who it affects. It affects all ages of our community and country, all ethnicities, all areas, all socioeconomic statuses, and all levels of education. However, some people are more susceptible than others. These include those with histories of trauma and poverty, and racial and ethnic groups. These groups can be seen as more vulnerable because statistics show that they are more likely to experience poverty and its effects. As for causes, one of the main reasons it exists is because it's a very profitable business. Unlike goods that are sold and used, humans can be sold multiple times a day and many times a week for many, many times a year for high profits, and they can be sold over and over again. There's also a low chance for arrest for these traffickers, so they feel that they can get away with it. There's lack of strong penalties for their crimes, so they think the pros of trafficking outweigh the cons of the penalties. And there's lack of public awareness of what to look for. There's limited training of government officials, and the locations in Nebraska increase the rate. The College World Series is such a hot spot for human trafficking each year because of Interstate 80 and 90 and the locations of those. It's a very common route for traffickers, and it's easy access and easy to hop on and off of. So what's being done in our community in Nebraska in this issue? Human trafficking was made a federal crime in 2000 by the passing of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This established methods to prevent human trafficking, prosecute traffickers, and protect victims and survivors of trafficking. In 2006, Nebraska made human trafficking illegal and described penalties for the crime. They stated that any person who engages in labor trafficking of a minor or sex trafficking of a minor is guilty of a Class 1B felony, and any person who engages in labor trafficking or sex trafficking is guilty of a Class 2 felony. There's also been a lot of governmental agency work that's been done in Nebraska regarding the issue. The Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services has trained more than 1,800 state teammates and professionals to recognize human trafficking and work to prevent it from occurring. In order to support survivors, the state of Nebraska is also administering a 3-year, $1.5 million federal grant to help the youth and children who have experienced trafficking. They offer them child advocacy centers and health providers across Nebraska with this money. The Douglas County Sheriff's Department has also worked to end this issue by implementing the Observe, Ask, Call initiative. This educates the public to observe of signs of trafficking, ask questions if they see them, and call for help. Nonprofit agencies that are working to address this issue include the Nebraska Alliance of Child Advocacy Centers, the Women's Center for Advancement, the Heartland Family Services Sanctuary House, and the Rejuvenating Women's Organization. The Rejuvenating Women's Organization provides short and long-term housing with a recovery program for victims. So the first approach that I thought of to address the issue of human trafficking in Nebraska is to implement an office to combat human trafficking within the Nebraska Department of Public Safety. The thought of this came from our neighbors in Iowa who have a similar office. This office would provide the following services. It would be a point of contact to combat trafficking and would be a specific governmental office that is devoted directly towards this issue to develop more strategies, more policies, collect better data, do research, and take more steps to end the issue. Costs to this approach include the cost to implement the office and hire employees, as they'll need some money to be paid for their job. It'll also include costs to develop research and reports, costs to take more steps to end trafficking in the community, and costs to implement whatever organizations or processes that the office chooses to do. It's impossible to know the estimate costs. However, I did do some research and looked at the amount that other governmental agencies budget, and often these are in the millions of dollars. A lot of money will be needed to fund this approach. For funding, about $550 million already goes towards public safety in Nebraska each year. With that said, Nebraska may need to budget some of this money towards this office. Another way that could help increase the amount of money that goes towards public safety is to take it elsewhere. Currently, 36% of the funds from tax dollars in Nebraska go to the Department of Health and Human Services. Taking some of that money and putting it towards public safety could help to benefit this issue. Some stakeholders for this approach would include governmental officials and workers that will work within this office, the Department of Public Safety, and agencies and researchers that are chosen to work with this office. Cons for this approach is the fact that it could further financial strain on the state of Nebraska. Funding may be taken from budgets that usually go elsewhere, so these departments might have less money that they usually have to spend money to work towards other causes. However, I think the pros outweigh the cons. With this approach, there will be better trained employees, better policies that are made, and more research that's done regarding trafficking. There will also be an office that's dedicated strictly towards human trafficking, which will allow for better work to be done. And of course, the effectiveness is it's likely to decrease the rates of human trafficking in Nebraska. The second approach that I thought of was to implement more efforts where there are heightened events of trafficking in Nebraska. The College World Series creates dramatic rises in trafficking each year. Many victims are brought here to be sold, and many people are taken during this time to be part of the human trafficking ring. As mentioned before, part of this reason is because of the locations of our interstates. This approach would implement stricter measures to combat human trafficking during this event. Law enforcement would work with organizations and employees that work at TD Ameritrade Park, employees that work at hotels in the communities and areas nearby, truck stops, and other organizations and institutions nearby. They'll educate these people and organizations on how to better look for victims of human trafficking. They will also implement more security systems to find suspicious activity, such as throughout the stadium, along the interstate, and at gas stations nearby. For the cost, law enforcement doesn't need any further funding, as they can just use their salary and do this work during their actual work time. However, there is a $125 to $500 fee per security cameras usually. If 500 security cameras were put around the World Series in Omaha, it would cost around $225,000. Funding for this could come directly from the revenue made at the College World Series the year before. TD Ameritrade Park generates a huge amount of money that's usually in the millions of dollars each year, so part of this money could be used towards this. Stakeholders for this approach include the Omaha Police Department, who will be doing the education and putting in the security systems. It will also include TD Ameritrade Park and the employees that work there, as they'll be giving a lot of the funding and training, and the citizens and employees in the area who will be area who will be receiving the training. Cons for this approach include the fact that this approach does not stop the problem until it actually happens. Someone is not able to identify a trafficking victim until they actually see the situation happening or occurring on the cameras later on. This puts people in vulnerable situations and gives traffickers the potential to still get away with the crime. However, the pros are that it's a great way to catch the traffickers in the act and penalize them for their crimes when you have the video right in front of you. It also saves victims before they go through a more traumatic situation. This approach was used during the Super Bowl this year in Miami. It led to the arrest of 47 criminals and 22 victims were rescued. Any arrest of a trafficker and a victim saved is a positive change. This will help do the same in Omaha. So the two questions that I wanted you guys to address is, number one, do you feel that Nebraska is doing an adequate job addressing human trafficking with what they're already doing? If not, do you have any further approaches that weren't mentioned? And number two, how effective do you feel my two approaches would be? There's a rise in human trafficking regardless of the many efforts this far. Do you think the approaches would actually stop traffickers from committing the crime? And then here's my references. Thank you guys for listening.